Hello, my name is Didac Llorens Cubedo, and this is a video class on the novel Eyre for the course Literatura Inglesa II, Ilustración, Romanticismo y Época Victoriana. My intention today is not to analyze the novel in general terms. This is something that the reading guide by Isabel Medrano, which you can have access to through the online course, does very well, so there is no need to repeat that here. But to give you an overview of the novel's context, its major concerns, and also its reception. And as usual, I'm going to be following a PowerPoint presentation, which you will be able to see on the screen. I will begin with a general introduction on the Victorian novel and referring to the most important women novelists of the time. The Victorian period is known, or it is considered, a golden age of the novel. The 19th century turns out to be the century of the novel. And I would like to consider a creative and a commercial aspect. Creatively, the novel becomes a lot more sophisticated. Novelists develop a stronger sense of narrative structure and technique, and they become aware of the genre's potential to convey ideas and to transform society. There is also an important commercial aspect because the novel becomes a commodity, a marketable good. It becomes, during the 19th century, during the Victorian period, the most popular and profitable of the literary genres, sold in 3-volume editions or also in serialized form, which makes the novel, as I said, very popular. During the Victorian era, and in spite of the ideal of the domestic goddess or the angel in the house, a phrase taken, as you probably know, from Coventry Patmore's poem. In spite of these idealized images of womanhood, more women will write and publish, and some of them will even aspire to make a living through their writing. We have, of course, the 3 Brontë sisters, Anne, Emily, and Charlotte, poets and novelists, and perhaps the most romantic of the Victorians, the most romantic of the Victorian authors. We also have George Eliot, the pseudonym used by Marianne Evans, a novel whom we could label intellectual or philosophical. And we also have Elizabeth Gaskell, a novelist especially alert to the peculiarities of community life, of rural life, as affected by social change, by industrialization. Elizabeth Gaskell is associated to a genre known as the Condition of England novel, and she also wrote an interesting biography of Charlotte Brontë, whom she met. Okay, so let's now go into Jane Eyre. Charlotte Brontë started writing Jane Eyre in 1846 in Manchester, where she had travelled with her father, Patrick Brontë, who had to undergo cataract surgery. So in a small room in Manchester, in semi-darkness, looking after her father, Charlotte Brontë begins writing Jane Eyre. She will continue the work on the novel on her return to Haworth, the Yorkshire village where the Brontes lived, in the company of her sisters Anne and Emily, but she was very worried by important family problems. On the one hand, her father's ill health and near blindness after this operation. Her father was progressively losing sight, and that posed a threat to the family's economy. And on the other hand, her brother Branwell was addicted, as you may know. He was addicted to opium. He had also problems with alcohol, and his health was deteriorating dramatically. In spite of all these family problems, in spite of all these difficulties, Charlotte Brontë worked on the novel intensively, and the text was completed in less than a year. Charlotte Brontë wrote Jane Eyre after the rejection of her first novel called The Professor, based on her stay in Brussels as a student of French, and also based on the character of Constantin Eyre, who had been Charlotte and Emily's French teacher in Brussels. We always have this vision of the Brontes as stranded and isolated in this obscure Yorkshire town, which is partly true, but they travelled. Emily and Charlotte travelled to Brussels. They travelled to London as well, which wasn't the usual thing at the time for a woman from the north. Anyway, coming back to the Professor, we could say that it is Charlotte Bronte's weakest novel. It was only published posthumously, and the severe criticism the Professor met spurred the writer, encouraged Charlotte Brontë to write something more genuine, something more powerful. We find, by the way, traits of Constantin Eyre in the character of Rochester in Jane Eyre. And there is another novel by Charlotte Brontë, inspired by her stay in Brussels, called Villette, but this is a later novel. Let's have a look at the literary context, the literary tradition Jane Eyre draws on, and a number of important influences. Although much superior in literary merit, Jane Eyre draws on the governess novel, a successful genre of the Victorian novel. Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, for example, would be another, or perhaps a more prototypical example of the governess novel. Becoming a governess was about the only alternative for an educated woman who did not marry and who hoped to earn a living. Charlotte Brontë and Anne Brontë themselves had been governesses for short periods. Governesses were perceived negatively. They were satirized for having no life experience. They were despised for being spinsters. It was commonly believed that they were likely to seduce the father of the children they were teaching and looking after. In governess novels, which could be considered romance novels, the heroine often has a difficult life. She meets rejection, she falls in love with her employer, but her love is unrequited or impossible, frustrated. These novels are typically sentimental and melodramatic, and they have a happy ending after a number of trials and tribulations that the governess has to go through. Although Jane Eyre has elements from the genre, it is of course much more than a conventional governess novel. We can also connect Jane Eyre with the Bildungsroman, or novel of formation. This is a definition of the Bildungsroman taken from Chris Baldick's Dictionary of Literary Terms, which is a very useful source, and which can be accessed online and free through the UNED website, through the Lion database. This is Baldick's definition of the Bildungsroman: a kind of novel that follows the development of the hero or heroine from childhood or adolescence into adulthood through a troubled quest for identity. And as you can see, this applies perfectly well to Jane Eyre. The Bildungsroman was a productive genre of Victorian fiction, or in general of 19th century European fiction. The term has been applied to other Victorian classics, such as Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, which is recommended as an optional reading and a very interesting contrast to Jane Eyre. As a Bildungsroman, Jane Eyre is a success story. The protagonist, Jane, begins the novel as an orphan who has no resources. She has everything against her. And Jane ends the novel as a happily married rich woman. As children, the Brontes lived in a highly stimulating intellectual atmosphere. They wrote from a very early age, individually and in collaboration. You may have heard of the Angria and Gondel sagas or stories, which have been published as the Bronte Juvenilia. They were familiar with the great classical epics, Virgil, Homer, as well as the works of English canonical authors such as Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, or Walter Scott. An important influence on Jane Eyre was a late 17th century early novel by John Bunyan called The Pilgrim's Progress. The Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory of Christian life that takes the form of a pilgrimage. The main character is a man called Christian, whom we can think of as an everyman. His name significantly and allegorically is Christian, and he has to go through a number of adventures. He has to fight and overcome a number of tests, often temptations and sins that he has to resist before he reaches the celestial city, the city of God. Although Bronte's novel is not primarily a religious text, its imaginative structure is clearly indebted to Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. Jane's story has her facing moral dilemmas with every new setting. Gateshead, Lowood, then Thornfield. After leaving Thornfield, we have this wandering in the desert, Jane lost in this moorland, this wilderness. Then she arrives in Moor House, where she is restored to health and self-confidence, and finally she comes back to Thornfield, and she is finally happy at Ferndean. This is a map, an illustration from one of the first editions of The Pilgrim's Progress, and you can see here a representation of Christian's journey. There are a number of settings and a number of trials or tests that he has to go through, as I was explaining. And a similar map could be done for Jane's pilgrimage, for Jane's story in Jane Eyre. We will now look at what could be considered the main theme of the novel, Jane's quest for freedom, or in more general terms, a woman's quest for freedom. The central theme could be formulated in terms of a binary opposition, freedom versus subjection. All her life, Jane longs to be free, but she will have to fight against forces that constrain or exclude her. The first one is class superiority. First the Reeds, then Mr. Brocklehurst and his family, and you may remember this scene from the Lowood section in which Brocklehurst's daughters arrive in the school, and they are very extravagantly and expensively dressed, while the Lowood girls are starving. We should also mention Rochester's sense of social superiority, and definitely that of his guests in the Thornfield section of the novel. You will remember Blanche Ingram and her mother, and the way they make fun of governesses. So we have one source of oppression, constraint, if you like, on Jane's wish or aspiration to be free. Another important source of oppression is patriarchal authority. And again we have Brocklehurst, the master of Lowood school, the Lowood institution, where the girls are brought up to be humble. That's the philosophy of the institution. We have also Rochester, who keeps his first wife locked in a room, who threatens to use violence with Jane when she is determined to leave him. This is towards not exactly the end, but just before Jane leaves Thornfield, and this is a shocking scene for us nowadays when we see that Rochester would be ready to use violence with Jane. There is also St. John Rivers, who tries to push Jane into a loveless marriage and tries to use her to fulfill his ambitions. And the third source of oppression or constraint would be institutionalized religion. And again, we have Brocklehurst and St. John Rivers. We have Brocklehurst's hypocritical evangelicalism, which allows the death of several girls at Lowood from starvation and cold. And on the other hand, we have St. John Rivers' firm, almost insensitive religious beliefs. So Jane longs to be free. This quote here, which I am going to read, expresses her pride and rebelliousness as a response to the constraints we have defined. This is when Jane thinks that she will have to leave Thornfield in order to go to Ireland, to work there as a governess, and this is shortly before Rochester proposes to her. It's one of the most famous passages from the novel. Do you think, because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. At the end of the novel, Jane is liberated from all these constraints. She marries a man whose social status is higher, a man who considers her his equal. She has left Lowood behind, and she has rejected St. John's proposal. So she is in many ways victorious. The binary opposition freedom versus subjection mentioned earlier is also reflected in the novel's imagery. There are numerous images of seclusion or confinement. For example, little Jane at the beginning of the novel, little Jane reading in the window seat behind the curtain, little Jane punished in the red room where she is locked, the vision of Thornfield from the roof as enclosed by hills all around, Bertha locked in the third-story room, Jane hiding in a corner with Adele at the Thornfield dance, Jane again hiding in the garden before Rochester proposes, Jane compared by Rochester to a bird in a cage. In most of these situations, Jane wishes to break free, to leave, and this is often what she does. The main male characters are, as we have seen, sources of oppression. They pose patriarchal threats on Jane's freedom, as opposed to the variety of female characters in whom she finds support and solidarity. We have Bessie at Gateshead, we have Helen Burns and Miss Temple at Lowood, Mrs. Fairfax and Adele at Thornfield, Diana and Mary Rivers, who are clearly inspired by Emily and Anne Brontë, at Moor House. According to the author and critic Adrian Rich, solidarity among women in Jane Eyre stands out as an alternative to the prejudiced vision of women as competing rivals. Rich also refers to Charlotte Bronte's novel when she writes about the concept lesbian continuum, which you are probably familiar with from other courses. And this is an interesting essay by Adrienne Rich on Jane Eyre, where she discusses some of these issues. It's called Jane Eyre, The Temptations of a Motherless Woman, and this is not, of course, a compulsory reading, but it's recommended if you are interested in the topic, and you may have access to it. Okay, we now move on to an interesting opposition between romance and realism, and to the important topic of the woman question. Romance and realism are generally considered to be opposed, but some critics argue that they coexist in Victorian fiction, and very especially in the work of the Brontes. It will be useful to look at definitions of both terms, romance and realism, again from Baldic's Dictionary of Literary Terms. A romance is a fictional story in verse or prose that relates improbable adventures of idealized characters in some remote or enchanted setting. So this is romance. And realism is a kind of writing that gives the impression of recording or reflecting faithfully an actual way of life. So, what elements of romance do we find in Jane Eyre? The most important is certainly the Gothical and fantastical elements. The most important one being the presence of Bertha Mason, Bertha Rochester. Her mysterious, disquieting and dangerous presence, the noises in the middle of the night, the events that cannot be satisfactorily explained, all these traits would link with the Gothic genre or mode. We also have among the elements of romance the status of Bertha as Jane's doppelganger or double. And that is to say, totally unrepressed, even though she is kept under lock and key, a totally unrepressed version of the governess. Feminist criticism has seen in The Mad Wife the embodiment of female creativity, which can burst but is often contained or constrained. Another romance element would be the presence of fairy tale motifs, motifs shared with such fairy tales as Cinderella, very clearly, Bluebeard, the story in which a young wife discovers that her husband keeps the bodies of previous wives locked in a chamber. And finally, there is also the fact or the circumstance that natural events, often in the novel, have a transcendent symbolic meaning. For example, the lightning that splits the chestnut tree and foreshadows Jane's separation from Rochester, or Rochester's call to Jane at the end of the novel, which is carried by the wind. Natural signs are an element of romance, and of course they also connect with the Romantics' vision of nature. On the other hand, we have realism as opposed to romance, and a significant component which would be the presence of the Victorian so-called woman question, an important debate of the Victorian age, which concerned itself with the social status of women. Should they be confined to the domestic sphere? Should they have a profession? Should they have a role in public life? And in a sense, Jane Eyre is a novel about the woman question. So this is a very important aspect. Both the elements of romance and the elements of realism are important, and they coexist. These are again two recommendations if you want to expand your knowledge of Jane Eyre. The first one is a book by my colleague Antonio Ballesteros. It's a book about doubling, about doppelgangers, and it has a section on Jane Eyre. It's called Narciso y el doble en la literatura fantástica victoriana, and the book discusses other novels like the Portrait of Dorian Gay, and also Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dorian Gray, sorry. And then we have an essay, an interesting essay on Jane Eyre and its connection with Bluebeard. Can Jane Eyre be happy? From John Sutherland's connection. Can Jane Eyre be happy? More puzzles in classic fiction. This is a very interesting book. It contains essays on various Victorian novels, and they are all very readable. And to go back to the woman question, at a point in the novel, the heroine voices a vindication of the rights of women, which has become very famous. And I'm going to read that quote now. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer, and it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. And I'm coming to my final section, reception and success. This would be section 6 rather than 5, sorry about that. The novel shocked some reviewers, but it received also very positive reviews, and it became immensely popular and a commercial success. Since Charlotte Brontë had used the pseudonym Corbel, there was much speculation as to the author's identity until it was finally revealed. People thought that Acton Ellis and Currer Bell were the same person who had written all these novels, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, Agnes Grey. People also speculated that the author might be Thackeray. In the 20th century, in 1966, Jean Rhys published the novel Wide Sargasso Sea, which could be thought of as a prequel to Jane Eyre, that tells the story of Bertha back in the West Indies, and the novel is set in Jamaica and Dominica. A few years later, in 1979, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goover published The Mad Woman in the Attic, which is a study of 19th century women's literature, and the central idea was that Bertha is an image of the female writer and her repressed creativity. This is something we discussed earlier. And finally, there have been, as you know, numberless adaptations for the theatre. There were several dramatic adaptations of the novel already in the 19th century, and later a number of TV and cinema adaptations. So that's all. Jane Eyre is a very important and emblematic novel for all the reasons that we have been discussing. It draws on a rich tradition, the governor's novel, the Bildungsroman. It amplifies it somehow. It has elements of romance. It has also realist elements in dealing with the woman question, and tracing its reception from the 19th century until now is a very interesting topic. I would encourage you to, after reading the novel, to read the reading guide, which is accessible through the online course. Read the section on Jane Eyre in English literature in context, and perhaps watch some of the best cinema or TV adaptations. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.